So today we are talking about React Router. Anybody knows already what React Router is? Or router?
No, not really.
Ricardo, do you know what router is?
I think we're going to be taking routes from the URL and redirecting to a specific probably action similar to how will a controller and a method will work in an MVC. It's just that we are doing that in the app instead of just going to the back end of the server.
Yes. So very good. That's very similar. So basically in MVC, as Ricardo said, what you do is you have your kind of like routes controller where you list all your routes and then you assign some kind of action to every route. So if an application, if the request comes in and it hits first thing it hits a router, if it matches some kind of route, it will execute that action. It's pretty much the same in React. The only difference is instead of execution action, you render a component, let's say. So in this case we would say, well, I mean, it depends on how you set it up, but we would say it renders a different page of the application. So obviously the router, what it really does is it enables us to have multi-page application, if I should kind of simplify it. So I think that up until now, I'm not sure if you have already implemented router or not in your exercises, but I would say that up until now you were doing just the one screen or one page applications. So you would create some kind of forms or something like that, and it would be all on the same page. There would be no navigation between screens or pages. So this is what router is good for. If you actually need to switch between different views, let's say, you can switch between different views without router, but router is much more sophisticated. It will let you to create different rules. It will let you to create fallbacks and things like that. You could have even nested routers, so you could have kind of sub routes and things like that. So obviously, to achieve that without React Router would be quite difficult. You can definitely achieve kind of very simplistic navigation between different views, let's say, but it wouldn't be as sophisticated as router. So if you need your application to have multiple screens, I would say you would definitely be using router. The router is something very well established. It is an additional library to your project basically, but it's very well established, and it's been kind of tested through time, because this router is basically based not only on React navigations and stuff, but on other navigations as well. So generally speaking, once we started doing single page applications, SPAs, so React and other ones, Vue and all the others, there was always this problem that we need to have multi-page application. We need to have URLs basically, because it wasn't enough for a lot of application to just render one page and just stay on that page. You would want different pages, and you would want those pages to be represented by URL. So from the very beginning of single page applications, people were trying to solve this problem. And obviously, as it goes on front end, they turned to the back end, as Ricardo said, and they looked at how do we do it on the back end, because in there it's established for decades basically how to do it. So they looked at that, and they created something similar on the front end. I'm not going to tell you which one was the first, because nobody really knows which router was the first on the front end. But anyway, and somebody created it, and then over time, with different frameworks, people started kind of tweaking it, and kind of thinking about what would be the best. Then new APIs in the browser came in that enabled you to navigate a little bit simpler, let's say, or a little bit more kind of in a kind of, let's say, native way, or as I would call it. So then a lot of routers change into that, and so on. If just what I just mentioned, just to give you an example, in the old ways, let's say, let me just bring up a browser a little bit, new window. So in the first versions of these routers, what you would have to do is, or actually, let me. Oh no, this will be fine. So the very first versions of routers for single page applications would have something like this. So they would say, this is my app.com, right? And this is your single page application. Single page means you render one HTML page and then you don't go back to the backend, right? You're just doing everything on the front end. And then obviously there was a need for having like books and then app.com book one and, for example, app.com profile, right? So you kind of needed these URLs in your application because you wanted to make sure that people can navigate between those pages and they are somehow represented with URLs. So it makes sense when you see it in the browser. So this wasn't possible in the first versions. So the way to work around that was that they actually added something like a hash. I don't know if you know what hash is, but basically they were adding things like this into the URLs. Does anybody know what hash in the URL represents?
I don't know.
Did you not touch on that at all? Right. So
Hash is in URL. No, I don't think so.
okay. So let's put something quickly together then. So basically, hashes in the URLs, they will let you reference something on the page, right? Where else would you use hash in the encoding?
In the passwords?
No, as you code, when you write your code, imagine your HTML, CSS. Where else would you? Well, even JavaScript. Where else would you use hash? You definitely have used it before.
I'm trying to think. ID, you know, no,
Yes.
some kind of reference to an ID.
Exactly. So you would, for example, in your CSS, you would write something like, input field, whatever, something like this, right? And this is you referencing something on the page using ID. So this hash basically tells the browser, I'm looking for something with a specific ID on the page. Obviously, and this might make you understand a little bit better why IDs should be unique, because there should be only one reference on the page for this. Now, let me show you what happens when you actually use it in the URL then, because you haven't seen it yet. So let's do, let's open new tab. I mean, let's just do this. So we have a new tab, right? Let me just do, actually, let me, that's not gonna work. So let's open code then. You're gonna have to go to code. Right, so let's create a new folder. And you'll create index.html in there. And let's do no. Alright, so this is our new page. Let's try if it works. So H1. We should have our hello world in there, right? Let me just, I should probably bring it up on the same so you can see it easily. Alright, so imagine that you have a website and we will put a lot of text on it. So let's do, let's put a lot of text in there. And then we will say something like title 1. Oop. Alright, so this is our page now. You see we have this long page that we're scrolling through. Now, what our hash is good for is if you have some page like this, you can actually tell the browser that when you open the page, you want to focus on one of the sections on that page or some kind of location on that page. The way to do that would be to say, okay, our title in here, let's say title 10, right? So if you scroll through the page, it's title 1, title 1, title 1, and then suddenly title 10. We will give it some kind of ID. So we will say this title has a special ID, right? So this is our special title. Now you can see in here nothing changed because it's just an ID. Now if I go ahead and I will put in this URL, I'll add a hash and I will say special, right? Then if I confirm that change in the URL, if I load that page, it will automatically jump into that section of that page.
So it's like a bookmark.
So it's almost like a bookmark on the page, yes. But obviously, you need to make sure that all your IDs are unique because otherwise it wouldn't behave properly. So this is used a lot on in a lot of places. So for example, if you go to where could we go? Wikipedia, right? So if you scroll through Wikipedia and you will find, for example, variations in here. Oh, I was hoping that this was okay. Anyway, so if you find the variations and you look at it, you will see that it has ID variations. Okay, so now if I load the same page, but with hash variations, you'll see that it will load the page on this location. Okay, so now if I share this link with you, I will share it with you actually on the chat. You can try it yourself. If you share it anywhere, whoever opens that page, it's gonna jump to the variation location, to that hashtag. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, this hashtag kind of thing is a valid part of URL. Okay. So now, as I said before, the solution to the routing problem at first was something like this. So book 1. So the frameworks at that time. Oh, what happened there? The frameworks at that time would do something like this. So what they would basically do is they would say this is the URL of my application, and then there is a hashtag hash which basically navigates in somewhere in the application and some kind of name after the hash, right? Because browser, when it sees hash, it doesn't really care. It just navigates there. I mean, it tries to jump to that section of the page, but it's not going to do anything else. It doesn't matter that the hash is there, right? It's just kind of like a local thing, let's say. So the early frameworks, the early routers kind of abused this in a way that they said, okay, why don't we just use this hash and the thing after to identify our routes, right? So that's how, if you look at some very old SPA applications, single page applications, you will see that they have URLs like this. And this is to basically overcome the problem with routing. So you can have multiple pages. And under the hood in the framework, they were not navigating inside of the page, because if you put something in there that doesn't exist on the page, it's just not gonna do anything, right? It's just gonna be still on the top of the page, no errors or nothing. So instead of actually navigating somewhere, those frameworks were intercepting the URL. So whenever you open the page or whenever the URL changes, you would listen for that event and you would check the URL. They would strip this part, they would strip the hash, and then you basically are left with just a definition of URLs, right? So that's how it was used in old frameworks. Now, going back to more modern way, in HTML5 it was introduced that you can actually change the location, which basically means you can change the part of URL without basically causing a refresh. So that's what this React router and others are now using. So again, the router is not specific to React, even though this React router is obviously specific to React, but the whole idea of router is not specific to React. You will find the same thing in pretty much any other framework. It might be customized a little bit here or there, but I think by now it works so well that I think pretty much all the frameworks kind of went the same way with the router. So that's one good thing between frameworks, is that the router is usually very similar. It's not that hard. It's not like a rocket science to set it up, basically. So that's what the router is. It will help you to navigate between pages on a single page application without actually refreshing the browser, right? So what is the point? I just talked about it. It's just to make sure that the application have multiple views or multiple pages. And what benefits do URLs give us? Well, one of the benefits is that you can actually it's easier for a user to read this, right? So if we go back to what is actually defined like now, if you see this in your application, you will know where you are at, rather than just seeing application.com. So that's one kind of advantage. The other advantage is that obviously everything has its own unique URL, so you can actually share that. You can, I can give this URL to you, you open an application, and it will open on that page. So instead of kind of doing it manually just through the links, you can do it through the URL. So instead of having one application with one URL that would render something like this, and then having links in there. So if you want to go to like third page, you would always have to go through three first pages. Instead, we now have URLs that you can share, and you can open the application in the state that you actually want to. This is also a downside a little bit, let's say, because when you architect your application, what you have to be aware of is something that we call hydration of pages. Anybody kind of has an idea what could it be, hydration of pages?
No.
Right. So what do we mean by that is that if you load your application in a single page application, it's a very unlikely that it's going to be just static data, right? You will have some kind of state in there. So you will have some kind of state where you might have users information, you might have like some kind of form information or something like that. Anyway, you're going to have some kind of information on that page. And as you interact with the page, you're going to be mutating that state. You're going to be saying, well, now I want to update this state to represent something else, or I want to add more data, remove more data, or so on, or load more data from the server. Then you go to the next page and you have all that data in your application. And on the next page, you want to access it as well, which is perfectly fine if you started on the first page. right? Because you already have that state in your application, and you're just moving to the next state, so the next page, sorry. So on the next page, so if I go first to slash books, and it loads all the books. If I then go to book one, you can just select the book with ID 1 from the previously loaded books, right? So you already have that state when you move in here. So that's basically means you have everything that you need to render this page. That's pretty much what hydration means. What we mean by hydration is that you need to kind of give the page some state so it can be rendered, right? So you hydrate it. Now, why I'm talking about this is because when you have a router, imagine that we have a router in this application, and you go to book one directly. So if I share a link with you to this URL, and you open it, then if you don't architect your application properly, you will see probably error, right? Because this page will not know how to will not have any data, will not have any state to render this page, this book, because it didn't load the books first. Okay, so there are two ways to write this application. One way is to make sure that you load all the books in here, and then once you navigate to a book detail page, you just take what you already loaded, give it to that page, and the page renders it. The other way to implement it is that in here you load all the books, and when you navigate to book ID 1, as you navigate to it, you actually load the details about that book from the server, right? So in that case, if I then share this URL with someone, as you open it, it would load all the details that it needs for the book, and it would just render it. So there would be no problem. So you basically rehydrated the page. Now, the hydration of pages is a big topic. It's basically part of the state management. There is many different considerations, and there is many different ways to do it. And every application and you as a developer need to decide if it's actually needed or not. So, I've been working on applications where there are huge applications, and they have, you go 10 pages deep, but there was no hydration. So really, there was nothing to do about it. It was just the requirement that there is no hydration. So basically, every time the application loads, you need to start on a home page. So you would have to start it was even like this, right? So you would have to start here. It would load some data. So for example, a user. Then you would have to go here to load some more data, and then you would have to go here to load more data. If you wanted to start again, if you made a change, for example, as a developer, let's say you're developing something on this page, on book one, on book detail page, sorry. Then if you change something and you want to see it again, you couldn't just refresh the page. You would have to go back to the home page, through the books, and to book one, right, to make sure that the application is actually has all the data necessary to load this page. So that was for that application, it worked that way. Other applications might decide, well, what we actually want is to make sure that every view is completely independent, so it just loads all the data that it needs. Obviously, now you might think, what is the advantage and disadvantage? Advantage is you can just share URL, it will be hydrated, people can just open it, and it will work exactly as intended. The disadvantage of this is that you might think it will load a lot of data, right? So you go here, you load some data, for example, about the user, but if you navigate into profile, it will load the same data, basically. It will load again data about user. The same for the books. You will load all the books, and then when you navigate to book one, it will load again data about book one. So obviously this could be an issue. It depends on application. It could be an issue. You could argue, somebody could argue and say, like, we are doing unnecessarily requests. We are loading unnecessary data, because why are we loading book one details where we already have it from books? And again, it comes down to architecture. So for every project is different, unfortunately, but you could, for example, you could say, well, when I load the page with books, all I need to know is I need to know the image of the book and who wrote it, and maybe the price, right? So it's some very basic data. When I actually navigate to the book, I want to have different requests to the server that will give me, a whole bunch of data. All the authors, how many pages, is it a paperback, is it hardback, and all kinds of stuff. A little bit of, example from the book, like, 3 pages of text or something like that. So if you architecture your application right, it will make sense. So you could say, okay, well, even though we are loading some duplicate data, it's a very, very minimal set, because I'm loading just a little bit of data about every book in here, in the list of books. And then when I come in here, even if I come straight away, like just sharing this URL, it will load all the data. So including the data that was there before, and much more data, and it will populate the whole page, and you can um, just view it, right, without actually going through the whole stack of pages. Obviously, you will end up in a situation where you will have to duplicate the loading of data. You will have to reload data that you already loaded. For example, for the user, right? This is always the kind of first example that pops up. If you imagine that you have a application like this, and the application needs a login, so it needs to be authenticated, it needs to tell you if you are actually a logged in user or not, then obviously you need to make sure that you handle that authentication at any point, any entry point to the application. So if you say my only entry point is through the home page, so if somebody puts this page in or any other page in, it will just error out, it will just show you error. That's fine. So you just handle your authentication on the first page. If you say that you can enter the application through any URL. So if you can go to books straight away, you can go to book detail, profile, and so on. Then you would have to make sure that you load the authentication on every single route, right? So if I go through book one, if you imagine the page like we have in here, this is description of a book, you would probably want to have something up here that would be like a user and the username and the menu for the user. So even on this page, when you just enter the application through this page, it would have to load the user. Again, down to architecture, you could either load the user on every single page, or you could make sure that your application, no matter which way do you enter it, only on the first entrance to the application, it will load all the necessary data, like all the kind of global, we call it global data, like a user and other things. It really does depend on what the application needs and the architecture. Yeah, so does that make sense, the hydration of the page?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we put a hashtag, what does it change then? If we have this hashtag, I was just looking at a website and I noticed that there is this hashtag Um,
Yeah, so if you see like something like hashtag slash, that means it's kind of old school SPA, old school single page application, and they basically handle the routing through the hashtag. So under the hood, inside of the framework, if you would have something like this, then the framework itself, when you open this page, the framework itself would say, okay, I'm opening this page. So the first JavaScript that runs, it would say, what is the URL? It would look at the URL, it would strip the first part, it would strip the hash, and the hash, and then it would take just whatever you have in here, and then in your JavaScript, in your definition of routes, it would find this route, and it would say, okay, for this route I want to render this page, so it would render that page straight away. So actually, even for some applications, and this is not just for old school but even new routers, what could happen if you don't set it up correctly, or maybe sometimes you want it to happen, you could see a kind of like a flicker, right? It could render first page, it could render some kind of like a loading page, which would be common for everything, and then it would navigate to something else, because obviously there is that a little bit of delay when you load the page and when the JavaScript actually decides which page to navigate to. There is a little bit of delay, let's say, but it could be.
now,
Yeah, sorry.
No, this is assuming, and back to Thomas, this is assuming that you are looking to a JavaScript application because you can just use that hash in any other front end stuff. Like for example, in WordPress, you create a navigation and you do that so that the navigation does not go anywhere, and they are not necessarily having any this meaning because this is particularly to assuming that you are looking to a page that is using a React app on it. Mm.
Yeah, it's not necessarily just React. It could be any framework. But yeah, so when you say JavaScript application, just it's a single page application. Basically, that's what we call them. They are obviously JavaScript applications, but like single page application, which basically means you load one page from the server and then you do everything else on the client. That's why we call them single page application. So if you see something like this, then you can already know, okay, this is very likely a single page application, and you can assume it's oldish application because we don't use this anymore. Yeah, it's actually funny because it might be, now that I think about it, might be a little bit of a security concern as well, because if I look at this URL, I would know that yeah, it's a single page application. It's very likely to be AngularJS application or some kind of framework like that. And then you can try and attack that application because you know already what framework they are using. So you can Google what vulnerabilities there are in that framework, and you can try to attack it. It opens whole world of possibilities. Obviously, when you see URL like this, you don't really know if it's a single page application or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So that's what I meant by hydration pages. So basically, it's about the state. It's about the data that you're loading during the application time, and then what happens when you actually refresh the page, or when you navigate to different view or whatever. The hydration of pages is not necessarily just loading from the server. Some applications, they will save all the data needed for rehydration on your local. So if you look at your, I don't know if you've seen this before, but if you look at your console in the browser, there is something called application, and then in here you have local storage, you have session storage, IndexedDB, and all these. These are all kind of storages where you can store data. So some applications, you can see that there is nothing now, but let's just save something. So if you open console, and we will say local storage is set. Actually, I forgot to save. Jesus, I forgot. What? What am I doing wrong? Oh, sorry, that's the. So we can do local storage, and then we can do something like hello world, right? So now if you look at the application again, you can see that now we saved hello world in our storage of this website. So now if I go to BBC, for example, right, and I look at, there is local storage for BBC, they're saving all this kind of data. And if I go back to my application that I had there before, you can see that it's still persisting. So this is a storage for like a persistent data that you can use inside of your browser. Obviously, it's not secure, because if you can see, you can just open the console and you can see what data is saved. So you definitely should not be using it to save users passwords or authentication keys or something like that. But you could use it to for example, to populate hydrate page, like for book, right? So you can say I will save all the data for book 1, so when you arrive to that page, I don't actually have to make a request to the server anymore. I can just load it from my local storage, right? So hydration of pages can be done many different ways. Okay, so that's basically the benefits what it could give us. Yes, so the other benefits, sharing, it's deaf friendly. So yes, as I said, you don't have to click through application to actually get somewhere. And yeah, and it's just very familiar from how the web works, even though under the hood it works a little bit differently. Obviously, elephant in the room, SEO. Unfortunately, these slides are a little bit out of date. I'm sorry, but the React router does not improve SEO. Right? You should be. This is kind of downside of single page application routers, because they don't improve SEO. What I mean by that is, uh, you can easily see this yourself if you go to oh, Jesus, why is if you go to view page source on any website, right? So if you go to view page source, this you will see exactly what SEO robots would see. Okay, so so SEO, obviously, I think you know already what it is. So SEO robots, when they index pages, they will literally just make a request to the servers, and they will say, like I did in here, give me the source, give me the text basically for this page, which would be the index HTML, and it would give it this, right? So in our case right now, because it's a static page, everything that's on it, it will give you that, right? If we go to, let me just go to the project that we had there before. So I think it was to do, wasn't it? Yeah. Oh, actually, it was yarn, wasn't it? Right. So this is what we did last time. If you look at the page source, not inspect, page source, this is what you will see, right? So now look at the page and look at the page source. So on the page, we have three to-dos. We have checkboxes, we have buttons, we have this little input box in here and everything. And in here in the code, you will see your HTML tag, your head tag. In the body, you will see some kind of no script notification if you don't have JavaScript. And you will see one single element, which is the root. This is the root of the application. Okay, so this is what a robot will see, because robots will just make a request to this URL and get this source. They will not actually render the page, right? And this is the single page applications. Everything happens after render. All the single page applications will look like this if you look at the source code, if you actually request it like a robot. They will not have any things that you would expect to be rendered on the page. They will just have this, because all the rendering, all the things that you put on the page will happen after the initial load of the page. That's why also the single page applications are much faster to load than like a full-blown pages, because they don't have to load all this code. As a trade-off, they have to load a lot of JavaScript, but JavaScript can be cached quite well, so that should be fine. So yeah, so this is what you will see. This is your whole application. The whole page in here is represented by this. So the same thing with the router. If you go to, no matter what URL from these you will go, you will always see just this, right? There will be no other information about the route that you're trying to access or anything like that. You will see just this, because in this route, this is the root element where the React will start after it was loaded. And once the React starts, then it will start analyzing the URLs and try to navigate you to the page that you need to go to. Not before that. So for the robot, because they don't render pages, they don't actually trigger the React render and everything else. For robot, it will just be this. So every single page that is indexed on your single page application will look exactly like this. Right. So that's actually a big downside of single page applications. and routing in single page applications, because it is a very misleading thing where you would think, well, I have URLs, it's going to be well indexed by robots, and it's going to be it's going to be good for SEO. It's not going to be, because you will always see just this, because robots do not render pages. That being said, there are some ways to mitigate this. So there are some ways to make sure that robots will see what you need to see, what you want them to see for these URLs, but it will be completely disconnected from your React application, right? You have to do it on the back end. You cannot do it on the front end. And this is a much broader topic that we're not gonna get into now, but basically front-end applications, single-page applications on the front end cannot be optimized for SEO without a backend. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So this shouldn't be actually here, but anyway. Yeah, so the API for using the URL. So as I said, these days, which when I say these days, it means HTML5. Let's just see if we can find HTML5H, how old it is. HTML5 was released in 2014, so last 7 years, basically, we're talking about now. Actually, yeah. So when I say these days, that means last 7 years. We can use APIs like this, APIs like this to actually change the URL and not having to use the hashes, right? So that's only last 7 years, basically. Yep. React Router provides React components and hooks which you can use with which you use the window.location. So this is why this is additional library, because and I think we talked about this before. React is a library, it's not a framework, so it will not tell you how to do things, right? So the router is another library that you can use in React, but you don't have to. And the way that this works is that this library will give you basically a means to manage your routing, which means that on the background it will do everything that you could do locally, manually, but you don't want to do that, because router, at the end of the day, it is more complex thing, and it's been tested and developed for so long that you cannot possibly write it better than what it already is, unless you you can try, but it's probably better to use a library that's been tested by the community. So basically, what the React router, what it gives you, it will give you components and hooks. Are you familiar with components and hooks?
Starting to be, yeah.
Yeah. So components, let's simplify it a lot. Components are basically kind of like a HTML tags that you define. Hooks are more like a functions, right? Let's just leave it at that for now. So it will give you kind of like a HTML tags, which are the components, and hooks, which are the functions, to basically interact with your routing, which under the hood it will use the window location that you could use manually. You don't need React Router to use that, right? That's just a default behavior of browser. But obviously they abstract it and make it much easier for you to use. There will be 3 main components to render for every React Router. So any project that you will open with React Router, it will always look the same for the router. There is a router component, which basically is like a wrapper for the application. Well, I say for the application, but for the part of the application which you want the router to apply for. I would say 99% of applications, it will be the whole application, right? So you basically want to the whole application to be, to have pages and to navigate through it. But if you want nested routers, then you will get into more difficult things with router. So that's the kind of main component that will encompass pretty much the whole application. Then there is a route component. The route component is I had a really nice tool in here last time. Where is it? There you go. So the route component is where you define your route. So basically, if I want to have a route /books, then I would put in the code my route component, which I would say this route is for /books, and then I would tell it what to do when that route matches. I will show you in a second. And the third one is link. For the router to work, so obviously because we are using the /URLs, normally the browser would reload if you click on /URL. So for the browser to work, for the routing to work properly, you need to have links that behave slightly differently from the default browser links, right? And obviously, to create a link in HTML, you use anchor tag. So you use this, right? Yeah. So you use anchor tag. So it's basically the same. It's just kind of wrapped in this component because it is a little bit more behavior, right? So one of the main things is that the link, when you click on this, it will add an event listener. So it will do something like, well, I will just use it like this. So anchor. Obviously, this would be some kind of reference to this. Anchor, add event listener, click. And then I would do event prevent default, right? So this piece of code would make sure that when you click on this link, it would not actually navigate anywhere, right? Because you saying in this prevent default, you should be familiar with that now. You're basically saying whatever the action for the click event on this element is, I do not want to run it, right? And that's the main usage what this link does, right? It does more stuff under the hood, but one of the things that it does is it will render an anchor element, and it will make sure that it prevents the navigation that would normally happen. So if you use your router inside of your application, if you want to navigate between pages within your application, so without refreshing or reloading the browser, you would have to use the link component. Okay, if you want to navigate somewhere else, if you want to navigate outside of the application or on purpose to refresh the application, you could use just normal anchor element. So basically, instead of doing instead of doing something like this, sorry.
No.
Right? So instead of doing something like this, what you would do is you would say link, right? Something like this, let's say. So that's the change. To make the router work as it should work, you just use their component instead of the anchor.
And the link component, you don't need to define it?
No, that's built into the router.
Sorry?
That is built into the router.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so all these components that you see in here, when you import your React router into your project, you will have these available basically.
Got it.
They are defined in that library. Right, so router wraps around routes. That's what I said. If you want to have routing in your application, the router, so this component needs to be on the top level, and then inside of it needs to be routes. In the router will pass some props to each route, which mostly happens under the hood, but we can definitely have a look at it later. And the individual route determines if it should display. So in every route, this is still router, but I will show you an example in here. So in every route, you will define the matcher, what we call matcher, for the path that you want to basically match, right? So in this case, we will say this is our up component, right? We basically import all this. This is our up component, and then we're saying inside of our up component, we want to use a router. And in that router, we will define, we have one route where the path is /home, we have other route where the path is /login, and so on. And in here, they are kind of ended straight away, but normally you would have what to render after that path is matched, right? The one thing to note is they will be matched in as you write them in your code. So if you have some routes that have some common name or something like that in there, then you would have to make sure that you put them in the order that you want them to be matched. Otherwise, you could end up rendering different route, different page. All routes must have a router higher up in the hierarchy. So yes, so that's what I'm saying when it kind of encompasses the whole route. And the one way to ensure this, that they actually are, is to put your router inside of your render. So the actual entry point to your React application, you can basically wrap the whole thing with a router, right? And when you wrap it with the router, then that means your routing is gonna be available throughout your application everywhere, right? There is nothing that can be above the router, yeah. And you can see in here what I was talking about before. In here we have this ID root element. That's the only thing on our page when you actually load the page. And you can see this React DOM render. You might have looked at it before. We're basically saying, hey, React DOM, which is the renderer for DOM, render on this element. And we're saying in document, get an element by ID, which is the root, and then this is what to render. And the thing that we render inside of the root is our router. So the first thing is our router, then inside of the router we will render our application. So that way we kind of make sure that the whole thing is encompassed in a route. Each route, a route component will render its contents if the path matches window location path name. So basically, when we say window location path name, that means after the domain name. So if you look at here, we have our domain, then we have slash, and then we have the path. So this is our path, right? So whatever you match in here, you need to match in here basically. So to be able to render it. So if you say this router, we are checking for path / home, and if that's fine, if that's matched, then render this home page. The same thing in here. We are looking for login. If that's matched, then render the login component. So these home page and login page, these are the kind of high level pages, right? So this is the big component that wraps the whole page, and then inside of it you would have all your logic and all your UI and everything for that particular page. The home page will probably be a / not at home, not a home. So again, in here, you know, you don't see many page websites that would have up.com/home, right? If anything, it could be dashboard or something like that. But anyway, you don't see that many that would have /home. Normally, it's just this one, right? It's just / basically. So you need to make sure that no matter that your page is actually called home page, what matters is what do you see in the path name, which is this, right? This is the path name. And then we have road path login, so it will match the login page as it did before. What will happen when the user is at login now? It would probably, I'm pretty sure it would actually render the home page, because as I said before, it will match the /, which is part of the login, and it would render this page, right? So you need to make sure that the page is actually in the correct order. Yeah, so the home page is rendered at login. You can see that. So what I would say is there are different ways. Again, obviously router thought about this, so they will give you different tools. One of them is you can pass a prop to your route, which is called exact, and you basically matching just exact paths of the in here. So for example, if I go to login, it will come here and it will say doesn't have slash but only slash, nothing behind it. If it doesn't match that, then you will just skip this route and go to the next one. So in this case, you basically prevent of what happened in here, because in here we didn't have the exact, and it would match this against the slash login as well. There are different rules about these matchers for paths. So you just need to be, you just need to read the documentation and play around with it a little bit to understand it more. Now going back, sorry, before we move on, does everybody kind of understand routes?
Okay, kind of, yeah. I think I do, yeah. I mean, no, the best is really when we do, I guess, when we do practical example. But
Yeah.
I see theoretically how it works. Yeah.
What about you, Christina?
I believe I need time to understand this.
Okay, Ricardo, do you understand it?
Yes, it's fine. Theoretically, I'm getting the point what it does.
Yeah. So this is the part when we were saying that it's very similar to MVC, right? So in MVC, you will basically do the same thing. You will just define your path, and then you will give it some kind of action what to do. The difference in here is, it's a little bit more markup, and instead of actually executing some action, you are rendering component, which basically is an execution of action actually, because components are functions that are running, but this is how it's represented on the front end.
Yes, I get it.
Yeah. Cool. So moving on, I use and navigate a website using anchor tags. We need anchor tags too, but link renders the anchor tag for us. Clicking doesn't reload the page, just changes the URL, causing a re-render. So yeah, so this is what I was talking about before. I kind of skipped ahead there. Basically, if you want to do the proper navigation through your application, you need to use your link tag, link component instead of anchor tag, because otherwise anchor tag will just reload the page. Here you go. So you put it on the page and you just say link to and which page you want to link. You don't have to put the whole URL. You just put your path where you want to go, and then you will say login please and stuff. So this renders this, right? So it renders the same thing in Anchor, but it will add the extra where if you click on it, it will not actually reload the page. It will navigate internally somehow. Dynamic links, you can have dynamic links as well. So you can have, for example, you can have IDs in the URLs, right? So when you define your URLs, you need to tell the router, well, this URL will actually have something dynamic in it, right, like ID, and then you can just render different links with the dynamic part in it. And in the dynamic routes, you would say, here are my yeah, so this is like an example of one not to do. I think that's what that's what is kind of mentioned in here. So basically, if you look back at the links, what we're saying is we want to have links to 3 different cuts, right? So cuts 1, cuts 2, cuts 3. And what you could potentially do in your router is that you hard code all your cut URLs. So you would say, well, I want to have 3 different routes. It's not as visible from here, but if we just write it down in here, so you would have something like route, path, cut 1, cuts 1, and then you render cuts, or cut detail, ID 1, something like this. And you could duplicate this 3 times, right? So you would have cut 1, cut 2, and cut 3. So this would work for that example in there, where you have, you have 3 links to a cut. So here, link, it will map to something, but anyway, it will render this. So 3 links to a cut 1, cut 2, cut 3. And then in here, you would just define 3 different routes. That would work, but it would be not dynamic, right? Like in this case, if you want to add cat 4, you would have to actually go to your router, the route definitions, and you would have to add another one, and another one, and another one, right? So this is not maintainable. This is not how to do it. So the way to do it would be to create dynamic route where you can do something like this. And again, this will be very familiar to Ricardo. And actually for you, for Thomas and Christina as well, because what we did this, if you remember, we did this with Express. I don't know if you remember, but in Express, when you define your routes, again, same principle, right? You're defining routes. That's why the routers in general, generally speaking, on the backend and front end, they are very, very similar because it's a proven concept and it works. When you define your route, you use this column to actually tell the router, okay, I'm having this path, and this part of the path will be dynamic, right? So we will say cuts, and the ID in there will be dynamic. And then you can just render, you can just use this one route for all of them, so it will be like a catch for all the cuts, and you use your cut page as a single cut page, because internally that ID will be then passed down to your component, basically. Well, you can access it from your component. So same like with other routers that you see on the backend or on the Express or anything, you can define your dynamic parts of the URL. And then, right, to the code editor. Let me just go through the rest of the slides, and then we will do some coding. So these are the three things, and then those were components. And now we're going over to hooks. Are you familiar with hooks?
Yeah, we've seen them a bit last week.
So again, the same concept. This React router will give you some kind of predefined hooks. One of them is use params. This is what we literally just talked about. So when you do the colon ID, this is where you can. This is how you can get that ID back, right? So when you put it in the URL, you need to access it somehow in your component, for example. So you can use params hook to get it. So if you look at the code in here, you will have your cut page. You will get your props, which are just any props. And then you can use the use params, which is part of the router, and it will give you the dynamic parts of the URL. So you can then work with it later. Again, you can go crazy if you want to. So there is cuts, which is ID, name, type. You can define whatever you want in there, and you can get as many params as you want from the URL. You can use it to fetch stuff from API. So obviously you have your cut page, and then you get the ID, and you just go on and get the cut from the ID. So this is what I was saying to for the hydration of the page, right? I guess what these two slides are trying to show is, don't go crazy with your data in your URL. You shouldn't. URL is not or path is not the place to put your data. So you have your cuts, you have the ID of the cat, but there is no point to put name and the type and other stuff in the URL, right? What you should be really doing is you put just your ID. So you see in here we load just the ID, and then you use that ID to load the data from elsewhere. So in this case, we have some kind of API, and we get the cut by its ID from the API, and then we will be able to render its name and the type. Right. So don't overload your URLs as well. Use history. This is right. So use history. I'm not sure what this slide is, but basically use history is as you navigate through the application, the router will keep the stack of pages as you go through application. So for example, if we go through app.com, so this is the home page or all the slash, and then you go to books, book one, and the profile. So if you use the history, it will show you this stack of pages. So it will tell you, okay, he went through these pages, and then you can somehow interact with it. There are countless of requirements for history page as well in any application. So they might tell you, well, if you go from profile and then you press back button, you don't actually want to go to this page. You want to go to books list or something like that. So then you can interact differently with the history. Use history uses the Windows History API. Windows History API. Again, what a nice thing. In the old days, what I'm saying, a couple of years back, we didn't have this window history. We had only you have to do it manually basically. But now we have this, so we can actually use under the hood. The router can use the native API for history, and then you can it's used a lot for redirections. So for example, if you get 404, then redirect to different page, right? So you can actually say history and then push 404. So not only you can navigate back through the stack, you can look at back through the stack. You can also push the next state basically. So you can say my next state will be this, right? And this is the difference between link and this is that link needs user interaction, while history you can do programmatically, what we say. So if you need to navigate somewhere based on some action that happened somewhere else or something that happened, and the user didn't actually interact with the page, then you would use history push. If you want user to first click on a link, so he interacts with the page, you would use link. And use prompts in the history to the coordinator. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the slides. Tell me if you need explanations for something before we actually go to the editor.
No, happy to go to the editor. Thanks.
Cool. So let's do. Let's just clean up in here a little bit. So let me just turn this off. And what was it? Router. We'll create our new application. What are you guys? Do you like React? Do you like kind of front end programming, or are you more kind of inclined to back end?
Yeah, I think I'm more. I mean, I think I quite like front end. I quite like React. I mean, I guess the whole. Yeah, I was gonna say it's been a long journey, so it's.
Yeah.
I think we are. Yeah, it's good that it comes to an end because we learned so much and we did so much that.
Well, I would say the most important thing now is to put it to practice, right? So even after this finishes, I would kind of advise you to choose some project, tiny project, small project, and try to put whatever you learn to use, right? Because then you will find that without like a pre-configured exercises and without the guidance and everything, you will do a lot of trial error, and you will learn a lot. But it's good that you have this background because it's going to be much easier for you than just starting from scratch basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's my worry is that I need to find something to because I'm not working in the space, and I fear that if I don't have a project, I'm just gonna lose everything I learned. So
yeah, you definitely should do something, and it can be something really silly, like, and anyway, these silly things, they are usually the best and actually earn people money. But like look at I would say look at like a public projects, like for example Giphy, right? So
Giphy.
yeah, so all these GIFs, they are being used everywhere, right? And they have they have like open API, and they have you can do searches, and you can do whatever you want in there really, with the data that they have. And there are so many like kind of cool applications for just like loading GIFs. So you can like one of my friends, when he finished his course, but it was a little bit more advanced. But anyway, when he finished his course, what he did was he created an application where you it basically turns on your camera on your laptop, and you show it an object, some kind of object. It will recognize what the object is. So it would, it was connected to some kind of AI in the cloud. It will recognize what kind of object it is, and then it would make a search on Giphy for that object. So if you give it a cup, for example, it would go here and it will search for a cup, and it will show you a GIF of something like, if you would say like a coffee cup. Right?
Nice.
Yeah, so it would select like a random one from these results, like this one, for example, and it would show you like a full page, like a full screen GIF of that, and you would be surprised how popular it spread like crazy through the office and everything, because it's just like, such a silly thing, but when you can take anything on your screen, on your desk, and show it to the screen, and it will show you something back that is related to that, you feel suddenly so attached to it, right? And it was literally, I mean, must have been like an hour to put it together, maybe no more, right? The AI part of it is not difficult, because camera the camera part of it is easy, because there are now APIs in the browser to interact with camera, so there's no problem. And the AI part of it, all the big players, all the big cloud players, so Amazon, Google, IBM, all the big cloud players, they will offer you a free AI image recognition service that you can use. They will literally give you like a link. You submit your image to it, and they will analyze it for you, and they will give you a JSON with basically like a list of things that they think are on the image, and how confident they are that they are there, right? So it's literally just making one post request or get request somewhere. They will give you the URL, and you will get back data, and then you just select something from it and use it. So it's very, very simple, right? Actually, that would be quite nice exercise.
Have you heard of? Oh, I'm sure you've heard of it. Have you done any coding with Elixir? Is that?
Yeah, well, I heard of it, but I didn't do Elixir. No, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is, to be honest, it's impossible to try everything. There are so many things. It's crazy. And with family, I'm finding it harder and harder to actually find some free time to do something. But you will find that
Who said like if you want to help me put together like some kind of he has like a website and some database for in the crypto world, and it's all done in Elixir. He said like we need to get up to speed on Elixir. Okay.
Wow, I don't know if I would listen to that advice, to be honest, because Elixir is one of the it's a cool language, but it's definitely not one of the mainstream languages. So like if you actually are serious about like potentially actually finding job as a developer, or being more serious about it basically, then concentrating on Elixir will not open many doors for you. I would definitely stick with one of the more known languages, like PHP or JavaScript or Ruby or Python and stuff like that. Actually, I recommend Python quite a lot, only because like most of the really advanced AI things are written in Python. And once you learn Python, you will be closer to that field basically than normally you would. But that being said, there are really cool. There's actually even there's even JS TensorFlow now. Yeah, so So they even have like a JS library now, so you can use it with just in your browser, really. So yeah, but I don't think
did
there's
like a Coursera class on machine learning with MATLAB and Python. It was quite nice, and
yeah.
it was a good intro to the AI world. It was quite mathematical, but it was very interesting.
Yeah, there is nothing for Alex here. I mean, this guy says that he was part of 2018 summer camp. So yeah. Anyway,
So nothing. Okay,
yeah.
interesting.
Right. So this has been installed. So let's get on with it. So I will just start it in here because otherwise it's going to bother me. So yarn start. Cool. So now we have our application. Let's just get rid of this thing. Where are we? Node.js. So let's just get rid of all this. Yep. And let's do one. So I think we were doing cuts. So let's do cuts. So you have our cut register, right? And then inside of it, we're gonna have some cuts. So now, basically, the first thing we need to do is set up the router. So in here, as I showed you on one of those slides, so if you go back, the best, well, if you want router for your whole application, the best thing would be to wrap the whole application in a router. So where was it? Yeah, so here, so you see React Render DOM render. This is the root. So if you look at here, render root is exactly the same thing, right? Let me just make this a little bit smaller so you see a little bit more of the code. Actually, I can close this for now. Right? So now we just need to basically wrap it as we did in here with the router. So you will see that we have bunch of imports in here. So the browser router basically because React is trying to be kind of render agnostic, so it doesn't tell you that it has to be rendered in the browser or it can be rendered somehow on the backend or anywhere else. So the same for router, because obviously we are using the window.location API, which is the browser API, right? So if you want to use the React router in somewhere else, you could, but it wouldn't be the browser router. For browser is the browser router, basically. So in here we will do. Oh, we need to install a package, of course. So here's terminal. So we will do yarn install React router DOM. Oh, of course. I normally use npm, but and we will start. So we will wrap our whole application in router. So we will say router. Oop. And we would do import was it browser router? Yeah, browser router router. Right, so now we basically wrap the whole application in our router. Right? You can see how the application is working. So now we can go ahead and actually define the routes. You can do it anywhere really, but you should obviously do it somewhere up on the, where you're gonna be actually having the, before you actually have the links and stuff, because otherwise they're not gonna work. So you can do it in here, you can do it in the application. Sometimes people actually define like a new router component that would define the routes. For the ease of it, let's just define it in let's just define it in here. Well, let's just define it in the application so it's easier to read. Right, so in the application we can define our routes. Or should we do it always? Right. Let's see. let's do it in here for now. So we will say our route path, and we will say default route, right? In here we would say render the application. So now we're saying on in our home page, let's say in our slash, we would want to render the application itself, the main one. It takes forever to refresh for some reason. Oh, we probably need to define it in here then, sorry. So let route up. Yeah, that's what I thought so, because it's the context. Oh. So in here we should define our routes. Yeah. So that should work. And of course this wouldn't be up, this would be something else. So in here we will create a new one, which will be homepage, let's say. And then we would do, what do we do, functions by default. And we can actually put this in there, why not? So. This would be it's never good to see this kind of comment in there. This is a bit of a hack. That's funny. I'm not sure why. Might have forgotten something. Yeah, it should be fine, but let's Google it, right? So
You didn't put import browser root or no?
I did. I'm just not sure if I need to call it somewhere. It's been a while since I used it, so I think I need to. Oh no, sorry. Right, that should be it. Right, so you have the home page, and we should have in here our return, of course. That should work fine. Okay. So now we already basically set up our first route. So let's look at the stack again. So we have our index JavaScript where we added the router. Okay, so we took the browser router, imported it as a router, and then put it in here. And then inside of the router, we render the whole application. Inside of the application, the first thing we do is we define the routes. So our main route, our slash, is a home page, right? And then in our home page, we actually do the cut register. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, so homepage is a component.
Yeah. So everything in React is a component, right?
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. It's a
yeah.
It's a
So
child.
yeah. So you can see that all these are components. There's not much. It's actually quite. It takes a little bit of adjusting, especially if you were using something before, because basically, if you need some kind of JavaScript functions or whatever, you usually wrap them in a components because everything is component, let's say. So it's a bit, yeah, it's a bit, you need to get your head around it. But yeah, everything is component in here. So
Can you show again how the router is kind of wrapping the app?
yeah.
Okay. So here you're in index.js.
So this is where we actually render the whole application. This is where after you page load.
And that's the one that is already, we never touched that one.
Yeah. And the only reason to put it in here is so it's everywhere, basically, the router. And then inside of the router we render the application. So this is your entry point. As far as you do this, you don't really need to do anything else, to be honest. So you can close this one. And then in here is where you define your routes. So we will have our path, which is the first one, right? The slash root. And inside of that we will say if this matches, we want to use homepage, right? What happens if we do this? It will not render anything because it didn't match anything, right? So we want our home page to be matched for the home page. So now we can define another one, and we can do the okay. So we can do the cut dynamic one, right? So we can say our actually let's do another. Let's do this one. So this is our home page, and this is our cuts page. So we can say cuts list page. Okay, and we will create another one, which will be cuts list page. Yes, and function cuts list page. Export default. That's this page. Return. Let's open this one. And then on the home page, we will say this will be hello to application. And in here, we will import the cuts page. Right, so there we go. So now obviously you land it in the application, right? So hello to application, and now you want to go to the cuts page. So we would go, just put this back. So we would say hello to application. We want to create a link. So we would say we want to create a link to cuts. Yes. So so this path is coming from our route definitions, right? So you see that we have route which has cuts in it. So that's why we're putting the 2 cuts in there. Go to cuts registry, and we need to import the link as well. So and we have link, yeah, and then we need to do this and this. Right, so now we should see link in here, right? So you see that it's rendered as a anchor. If I inspect it, you will see that it's just rendered as an anchor. But already this has some kind of special behavior to it. Yeah. So now, if I go to, if I actually click on it, you see I render the get register. Now you can see a weird behavior in here where it rendered the whole the hello page, the home page, and the cut register page. This is because of our route definition. So you can see that it will actually match both routes because it has the common thing in there, right? So /cuts has also the slash from here. So that's where the exact comes into place. You can say this is going to be actually exact match. So in that case, our cuts will be just cut register, right? Now in our cut register, let's put a another link where we can say buck, for example. So link. No, oh yeah, I did import. Nice. So link, and we say to home, and we would say buck. I can't do that. Okay. I have to do this. Okay. So now we have backlink. So if I go back, it will take me to home page. And if I go to cuts register, it will take me to cuts. Look at the URL if you can see it. You see how it's changing when I navigate between those two, right? And now let's do the dynamic one as well. So we would say another. So let's close the home page, and now we are on the cuts list page. Now let's define a couple of cuts. So we would say cuts. This is just a mock data, right? And we would say ID 1, name Garfield, ID 2, name Max, ID 3, name Smudge. Right? And now we want to render a list of the cuts. So we would say cuts map. You should be already familiar with this, right? So cuts map cat, and we would render link. And inside of the link, we would say cut name, and the actual URL would be yeah. Okay. would be /cuts slash the cut dot ID. Right. So now we're saying basically render a link to cut/cut ID. So now we should hopefully see a list of cuts in here. Garfield's max match. Let's just put them in. You know. Right. So now we have the list of 3 different cats. If I click on it now, sorry.
How did you make the main page disappear? Because before, when you were clicking on it, it was just adding the cat register.
Yeah, so that was because in here we added the exact in here, because before it matched both URLs. That's why you could actually see it in there.
Ah.
So the same way for now. I will show you again. So same way for now, we will define a new route that will have the cut ID, right? And this will be cut detail page. Okay.
Okay, so if you don't put exact to cats, you will have the same issue.
Exactly. So if I do now new and I will say cut detail page, and I do function cut detail page, export default cut detail page, and I would do return cut detail. Yeah, so that's that. And in here you just need to import it. So again, cut detail page and cut detail page. So hopefully now, you see that if I start from the home and I go to cut registry, you see the cut registry with three different cuts. If I click on one, it just adds it there. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
So we would have to do again exact in here, and in that case, once it refreshes, you see it goes back to cut detail. We can add this in there as well. Let's put different than matter. And we would say cuts. That's right. So now we would have the link back to cuts as well. Right, so we go back, we have a list of cuts, we go to max, we go to cut detail, right? So now the kind of the last thing that you need to do is actually get the details about the cut inside of here, right? So for that, let's just print out the ID first, right? So inside of your cut detail page, that's where you want to get the details. So you want to import the hook, which will be use params. Yeah. And then inside of here, we want to get the ID from the parameters. So ID, and we just call use params. So this will give us the ID. The ID is because we defined that it's going to be ID. You can name this anything you want, right? But it's ID in here. You can see that we are handling the URL with the ID, but we are not actually passing the ID anywhere here, right? This is like a common page, but inside of the page we are getting the ID by whatever the router provided us, which is this hook, right? So now we can say cut detail, and we can actually print out the ID, right? So ID. So cut detail 1, cut detail 3. See, we have the cut detail. Just to show you that it actually works, we can put the cuts somewhere here. So we would say cuts JSON, and instead of the here, we would have them here. And right, so now we have the cuts in here in our JSON file. So we can import them as well. So we would say import cuts from cuts, and the same in here, detail page, import cuts from cuts. So now in here we get the ID, so we can actually get our cut, right? So you can say cut equals, and then we just find it. So we say cuts find and we would do yeah. So if record ID equals ID. Okay, and obviously in here, whoa. And obviously in here we would have to do let's go to cuts. Function, okay. And in here we would have to do cats, or actually data. Let's do data. We could do data dot cuts. All right. Mm-hmm. Right, let's just, I'm not sure if we can actually do this with JSON for now, so let's just do this in JavaScript. So rename JavaScript, and we can just do, oof. We can just do a export right, so in here we can actually put the cuts then, and in here we should be able to get them as well from cuts. Oh. And the detail in here we just do that. And then in here we do, can you actually do this? I don't even know if you can do this. Of course you can do this. Right. Of course this and this, and that should work already. Come on. What? Yeah. Oh, that was weird. Right, so now we have the registry. We have Garfield, Max, and Smudge. So we have the cuts from actual like a central data. And if I go down here to Garfield, I have the one. So now we have the data with cut. We should be able to say cut detail for, and in here we should say cut name. And that should hopefully work. Nope. And that's because this will be an array. Cut. Well, it's not going to be an array, it's going to be because it's undefined. Cuts.
Is this because you only talk about ID in the line 7?
I mean, that should be fine. I'm missing something silly in here again. Save the clock. Let me just do, where's my cuts? Where's my cuts?
Because you didn't do cat.id, you just did ID. So why are we doing cat.name? Where is cat?
Yeah, so the ID is coming from the use params, and then we're comparing it with the record ID. And what?
Isn't it cats.name? No.
No, it should be the cut name because we
yeah,
basically
it's one cat.
Yeah, we're finding it. I'm doing something very silly in here, definitely, as always. So we have the cuts. It's an array IDs, and we have the ID, right? Oh, do we have the ID actually?
It's an array.
Oh, it's a string. Yeah, it's a string. That's why. So we need to parse it basically. So parse int. Yeah, because it's coming from the URL. It's a string. Right. So this is basically, this is it. Yeah. So you're getting your ID from the URL. So this dynamic thing, and yeah, we finding it in the records, and then we just display the name. If I now go and manually change the URL, you see it will be there. So I'm basically loading the application. The first point of entry is being cut detail page, so it doesn't even go through the home page and the cuts, and it displaying me this details, right? So now if I take this URL, actually, do I have ngrok? Let me check. I do have ngrok. So if I do ngrok http, what is it, 3000? Right, so now yeah. So now I can share this URL with you, and you can check the navigation yourself. If you open this URL, you are basically coming to this application that I just wrote, and you can click through it and see, you know, how it behaves. You can change the URL in the address bar directly, or you can navigate through it clicking on the links and so on.
How did you do that? You just created a quick server?
Yeah, so there is a tool called ngrock, and basically you give it a local port, which in our case is 3000, and it will create like a public address. Basically, it creates like a subdomain, and
Right.
you can share your local uh, server basically with the rest of the world. It's very very useful.
Can you see that I'm on it? No, no. You
Yeah,
can't
you
see.
can see, if you can see my screen, you can see these requests in here kind of ticking away, so I can see that you are doing something.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so this is basically it. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, Christina, how do you feel about all this?
It's the same. I need time to understand this.
But do you understand at least some of it?
So it's really good for me as I'm a designer to understand, to see how you work. But yeah, I
Okay,
need more time.
that's fine. What about you, Ricardo? I don't think Ricardo is with us. Oh, he is.
I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. I
Yeah.
was finding the unmute button. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah. Do you kind of understand how everything clicks together and stuff? And
Yeah. I got the idea based on the concept of routing, but yeah, I mean, obviously this takes a lot of practice, and at the end of the line, I'm more into the back end with my PHP stuff. So this is gonna be really helpful after I practice it. So it's great knowledge. But yeah, I'm clear.
yeah, I mean, I would say so for like you, probably more important. I would say, in a bigger projects, you should be a little bit careful about like mixing single page applications and backends, because obviously you could end up with URL being defined in here, and then URL being defined on the backend as well. And if you put
Yeah,
the sorry,
exactly. And I'm more into working with frameworks nowadays. So between Symfony and Laravel,
yeah,
they in this aspect, like Laravel have the Vue.js, and then it's probably more appropriate for Symfony. And there are a lot of documentations on how they to integrate together.